tell us about God? What can philosophy tell us about God? I've been studying the issue of God's existence for a little while now, and I've gone back and forth on these issues and wanted to talk tonight about what can we know from science versus philosophy. And I think they're both good, they're both useful, but they're both different, and we can get different, as I just said, conclusions out of both of these kinds of arguments. So, what can we know about God? We're going to define these terms, and I want you to shoot me some comments if you're watching this. If you have a question, um, type your question. I'll try to keep up with the chat as best I can. So, I went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, started in 2004, and was really impressed. I didn't know much about at all about philosophy or science or apologetics or anything like that. So I was starting from scratch, basically, and I didn't understand the differences between, say, SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, and Biola. And I learned quickly that the way SES and Biola and other schools do things are very, very different. And so it's popular to use scientific arguments for God's existence, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Where we're going to see some things that science maybe can't do for us, and what philosophy can do, and a follow through that science can't do. But I was impressed, and I'm still impressed with scientific arguments, especially I'm interested in astronomy, so I like to go back outside and get my telescope out. My kids like it. We'll get scope out and we'll see things. We've seen most of the planets. I think I've seen all the planets except for Neptune. That's the one I guess still got to see. You can see all kind of cool stuff. I've really been into that for a long time since I was about 12 or 13 or so. Love the night sky. My wife's more into biology. She does more of that kind of thing. So no matter where you point a microscope or a telescope, you see the wonders of God. And so I think that science tells us that because creation is so incredibly detailed, intricate, and all that, that this can't have happened from chance. So how far can it get us? And how far can philosophy get us? Well, let's start to define our terms here. So, science is the comes from the Latin scientia, and for some reason my stuff here is not working. My slide clicker. I'm gonna keep talking, and maybe we can get this to work out as I'm talking. But the word science comes from the Latin scientia for knowledge, or scio for I know, and uh, typically, when we talk about science today, we talk about biology and chemistry and the natural sciences. Um, but that's not what the word has always meant. Hello. Good to see you guys here. Thanks for being here. I'm trying to figure out why all of a sudden, maybe it's my pedal. Maybe I can do this with different. This is a little bit risky because I haven't. Let's see here. Does that do what I want to do? Yes. Okay. Now let's start here. All right. Let's see if this works. That doesn't work. So I'm going to go old school on the slide thing here and do this the way I don't want to do it. But science, when we use the word today, we typically mean the natural physical sciences, okay? Chemistry, biology, astronomy, those kind of things. And historically, though, something was scientific if it for example, go back to Aristotle, something was scientific. It could, if you had a body of knowledge that could be that you could demonstrate your conclusions, and it was organized in a demonstrable way, and you use first principles and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Um, well, that so anything in that sense could count as a science. All right. So theology counted as a science. So theology was known to be the queen of the sciences, actually. And where was philosophy in that? Philosophy was her handmaiden. Okay. So good question over here. So what do you think of the quote that a lot of atheists say, I believe in science, not religion? Great question. If I were talking to somebody, because I always use questions, I would ask them, what do you mean you believe in science? What does it mean to believe in science and believe in religion? I mean, I believe in both. So science is just our view of knowledge, and of course, they're probably going to believe it. They're going to think they're going to talk about biology and all that. That they believe in empirical data from chemistry and biology and all that, and not religion. So I would say, well, I think we have to have both. Religion shouldn't be blind faith, and it's got to be rooted and grounded in reason and evidence. Because we can't just believe something for no reason. I mean, that just by definition, it would be unreasonable. So, great question. Appreciate that question. So that's what science is two ways of looking at it. The old school way is a general body of knowledge that you can demonstrate your conclusions, and you can use first premises to do that for first principles like law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, and all the logical stuff like that. Okay, so philosophy, though, and this is what my students now, and I teach for apology online classes, and they're learning this too. So philosophy means love of wisdom. The Phil part, love, and the Sophie part from Sophia mean wisdom. But really, philosophy is um, nothing is working. Everything was working great until it went live, right before it went live. Then everything blew up on me. Um, let's see. We're going to get to philosophy in a second. So going back to science. Now, I first of all say before misunderstood that I think that scientific arguments are unbelievably powerful. In fact, I'm a visiting scholar in a scholar community with Reasons to Believe, with Hugh Ross and Fuzz Rana and that crowd. I'm part of that whole organization. I love it. I actually gave this presentation out there when I was visiting back in June of 2023. So I think the ID arguments and the scientific arguments are very, very powerful. I think there's some limitations there. We're going to look at that in a little bit. The nature of these arguments, or these ID arguments, are based on analogy, such as the watch analogy. If you're familiar with William Paley, so for example, if you're walking out in the woods, Paley says, and you come across a watch, you're not going to think that it just was formed by natural forces. Why? Because it has obvious what's called specified complexity, meaning that it's working, all its parts are working together, and for a purpose. It's got all these different parts, and if one of them didn't work, then the whole thing wouldn't work. But you can tell there's some design to it. It's not just made, I won't say created, but made by erosion and wind and whatever else. Okay. So these arguments are based on the nature of what it means to be designed. Okay. Now, Hume objected to this kind of thinking. So David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic, okay, back in the 1700s, old skeptic, right? He objected to this. He says that this kind of arguing, this arguing from design, actually, he says it's a posteriori in nature. You might say, well, what is that and why is that bad? Well, what it means is you're arguing from effect to cause, or you're arguing from what's known through experience back to something that's not known, but something starting off like for example, the ID arguments are a posteriori because you're starting with something empirical and experiential. The Kalam argument, any kind of cosmological argument, the moral argument, depending I guess on how it's formulated. So why is that bad? Because for people like Hume and Kant and others, you can't get to something. Even Augustine thought this. You can't really get to an eternal necessary being from contingent experience. So only something that's a priori known before experience could really get you to this kind of knowledge. And so well, I don't think it's a good rejection or a good argument against the ID way of proving God exists. For Hume, it was an objection. He also alleged that this kind of analogy, this ID analogy, and it doesn't matter where you're looking, whether it's in biology or astronomy. Anytime you're saying there's so much evidence here that there can't be chance, right? We're looking at the cell, looking at the eye, looking at the brain, looking at the the galaxies in the universe on whatever a micro or a macro level. It doesn't matter because it looks unbelievably designed. All right. So if you look, for example, Hugh Ross says there are, at last I checked, 122 different constants that have to be the case for life to exist, like the exact tilt of the Earth, the exact amount of oxygen, nitrogen, lightning, plate tectonics, the position of different planets near Jupiter and everything. So if anything was really off kilter, we wouldn't have life here. So this is interesting so a lot of people know that I'm into ufology, which is the study of UFOs and all that kind of fun stuff. Well, people will oftentimes say that, well, because there's so much, everything's breaking down. Because there's so many stars in the universe that there's got to be life somewhere else. Well, Fozrana has a great discussion on this. In fact, he and Hugh Ross and I were on a panel a few years ago at our conference at SES at our apologetic conference. I think it was back in 2022. And he argued that there's got to be so many specific conditions for life on various kinds of planets that actually it really isn't as obvious that people want to say that there's got to be life, and there may be. We can't know there's not, but the chances are really low because the for carbon life and silicon life has its own problems. But for carbon life, you have to have really specific kinds of conditions. Okay, so other objections that Hume talks about would be, for example, that the cause, whatever is causing the effects, is proportionate to the effects. Okay, and doesn't so it says it's not necessary. So, for example, if the effects are temporal and finite, then the cause doesn't have to be anything other than temporal and finite. Okay, or if it's not perfect, then the cause doesn't have to be perfect. If the effects are many, you don't necessarily get one cause. If you don't get immateriality from the materiality of the effects, and you don't get, for example, the universe being created out of nothing. What do you guys think of this? If you guys are watching, a few of you here, see some comments. Do you agree with Hume? Do you think he's got some good objections? Do you think that he's wrong on these objections? I'll give you a hint of my view. I think some of these are good and some of these are not good. So what we're going to discuss these as we're going along. But what do you guys think? So tell me what you think. I don't think number one is good because I think that, I do argue a posteriori for God. I prefer the cosmological arguments personally, and they're all a posteriori. In other words, you start with the universe and you argue back to a cause. Okay. Um, then we've got the alleged analogy. Is that a false one? Is there really the analogy here is between a watch and a watchmaker and the universe and a universe maker. Okay. Not just a maker, but a creator. So what do you guys think? Hume right here, not right here. I'm going to keep on going. Immanuel Kant, after Hume, has other objections as well. He says, and this is very similar to what Hume says, that we can really only infer an architect, not really a creator. Okay, and this shows that he says this to show that matter is contingent. I mean, it doesn't have to exist. Would require a transcendent argument, and the idea argument is not a transcendent argument. What does that mean? An argument that really, just that it transcends the order of the universe, and the idea argument doesn't. It pulls from the universe, not a transcendent one. We see the attempt at presuppositionalists to give us a transcendent argument. Personally, I don't think that works very well. I don't think I've ever heard anyone make that argument, articulate it very well. He also says Kant is physico-theology, basing theology on physics and the physical world, cannot tell us anything definite about such a being as God, which sounds a lot like what we hear from Hume. That Hume says, well, we start with the effects being X, Y, and Z. It doesn't give us monotheism. It doesn't give us creation ex nihilo. It doesn't tell us, how many gods there are. If he's an omni-God, if he's infinite, if he's all-knowing, all-powerful, omnipresent, and all that. You guys agree with that? In other words, we cannot know the cause from the effect. So we can't start with the effect and reason back towards the cause from what both Hume and Kant say. Now, for different reasons. And Kant also says such an argument is also based on the ontological one, which is given by Anselm. And that argument says that God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. It's better to exist in reality than just in the mind. Therefore, God must exist in reality, or we can conceive of a being, if he just exists in the mind, we can conceive of a being in reality that's greater than God, which is a contradiction based on what the argument says. Now, I don't think that's true. I don't think the cosmological arguments are based on the ontological one. That's what Kant says, though. Okay. Here are some objections from a Christian. This is a Catholic theologian, philosopher. His name is Maurice Holloway. He has the best book, I think, on natural theology. What's that? Well, we discussed this last time in our live section. If you want to know what that is, we have another live now recording on the channel on what is natural theology and what does it tell us about God. But in short, natural theology is what we can know about God through nature. Okay. This is the best book, I think, on natural theology. I will leave a link in the description. But Maurice Holloway, Introduction to Natural Theology. I'm making my PhD students read it right now. We're having a class on philosophical theology. Can we prove God's existence? How far can we go with that? What kind of attributes can the world get us from that? But here's what Maurice Holloway says, and he's a Christian theist. He says, since such arguments, what arguments? The physical arguments from science. Since such arguments are based upon the laws and theories of positive science, again, that's like chemistry, biology, physics, those kind of positive sciences, natural sciences. The arguments themselves can never achieve greater certitude than that of the laws and theories, and the scientists dispute among themselves as to the relative truth or value of their laws and theories. And that's all well and good, and that's true. So, for example, scientists dispute among the nature of the beginning of the universe, whether it's a Big Bang, whether it's oscillating or steady state, if it's inflationary, not inflationary, whether the second law of thermodynamics applies to the whole universe. So there's disputes here among scientists, and if they dispute it, then our arguments really can't be any better than what they give us in their own theories. Okay, so he says, since the laws and theories of positive science are based upon sensible phenomena, as in some way physically observable and measurable, they can never be used to transcend the phenomenal order. Okay, this is kind of what Kant was getting at in a way, not completely, but God, he says, as a term to be demonstrated, entirely transcends the phenomenal order. Thus, any proof that is strictly and merely from positive, or I'll say natural science, that should say, can never demonstrate his existence. And so, this is one of the points that I make on all this, is that natural science studies what? You could throw this in the comments here. What does natural science study? Well, it studies living things and physical things and stuff we see in the microscope and a telescope and everything in between. In short, it's natural science studies nature. Okay. So, but God, in the theistic view, whether you're a Jew, Christian, or Muslim, believe that God is supernatural. What that means is he is above or transcends the natural order. So God is not part of nature. Now, there are people who believe God is part of nature, like pantheists, for example, in some way panentheists and that kind of stuff. But if you're a traditional classical theist, then we believe that God is, that he supersedes, he transcends, he's above supernatural, right? He is above nature. He's not part of it, he's the creator of it. Okay. So if God is the creator of it, then the question is can natural science tell us about a supernatural being, or is natural science locked into, as it were, nature? Okay. The next objection that Holloway gives is, even if we were to grant that positive, again, natural science could establish the existence of some super mundane principle, it could never go on to prove that this principle is God, namely a necessary being and pure act. We're going to see what pure act means here in a little bit. To reach such a term, that is to reach God, one would always have to resort to principles that are truly metaphysical. What does that mean? We're going to get there. But he seems to be agreeing with Hume that even if we allowed some kind of super mundane being to be not the creator, but kind of a fashioner and designer of the world, the universe, then it wouldn't give you the omni God that we want to get as Christians. Okay. Thanks, man. I'm going to throw this up here because I'm going to. Appreciate it. My buddy Jorge here helps me with all my tech stuff. Thanks. Appreciate that, man. Number 4, the objection he also gives next. Although no argument from positive science is of itself conclusive, It may still have a certain apologetic or ad hominem value for those who have absolute and exclusive faith in the laws of positive science and consider them as entirely proved and certain. Such arguments have also a persuasive force for ordinary people. Now, what he's saying here is that, well, even though the scientific arguments don't really get you a full blown view of God, they can be used um, by apologists or scientists or theologians to help people understand there needs to be a God, even though the arguments themselves aren't airtight. So we could debate this. How should we use arguments that aren't really going to get us the full blown thing? If we want the full Monty, do we really have to? Can we use these arguments? We have to go to the arguments and start using them to get full blown theism. Okay, or can we allow people to believe in God? Now, practically speaking, most people, if they're going to be convinced of some kind of design, whether it's in biology or astronomy, they're going to be persuaded that, yeah, this isn't by chance alone. For example, to use the book title, the 20th century's most notorious atheist, Antony Flew, converted to some belief in God. Some say deism. Gary Habermas says theism. They were friends. I'm going to go with Gary on that one. And I have a book written on this topic by him, and he was convinced by the design argument. So while we might not think the design argument gets us full blown theism or even deism, uh, practically speaking, people will make that move, and that's exactly what Maurice Holloway is saying here. All right, and then the last thing he says is finally, as it should be obvious, no objection based on positive science has any value in disproving the existence of God, since positive science functions in an entirely different order from philosophy. It is as equally incapable of disproving there is a God as of proving it. In other words, if science can't prove God because it can't make statements about the supernatural order, then it can't disprove him either. At natural science, he's saying, only deals with nature. You guys think that? You guys think you agree with that? Can natural science, in principle, give us God's existence, or is natural science so locked into the natural order that it just by definition cannot give us um, any knowledge about the supernatural? So let me know what you think. Now, so here's what I think, granting the validity of the ID arguments, and I want to be clear again, I think they're incredibly powerful. I would use them. I don't tend to use them for various reasons. First, I think the philosophical ones are stronger, and two, I'm not a scientist, so I'm more well versed in philosophy. So as bad as I am in philosophy, I'm much worse in science. So I tend to stick with the cosmological type arguments, but granting the validity of the ID arguments, and I think they are valid, they do prove at least one highly intelligent designer has existed. Notice I says has existed. I'm not saying does exist, because I don't think that it can give us a necessary being. So it doesn't show, I don't think, that the being still exists, but I think that philosophy can. Okay. So what do the idea arguments not prove? I don't think they prove monotheism. I think that Kant and Hume and Holloway are right about this. Why? Because saying that humans or the universe are incredibly remarkably designed, I think they are. You can't infer from that just alone that there is one singular monotheistic being. You could perhaps have polytheism. Now, if you've watched the really interesting documentary by Ben Stein, which is called, um, it's the one on academic freedom, intelligence, what's it called? Expelled, yeah. Expelled, no intelligence allowed. At the end of that documentary, Ben Stein interviews Richard Dawkins, who we know is a well-known Oxford biologist. And he's very, very rabid about his views of Darwinian evolution. He considers himself an atheistic evangelist for that view. And so even Dawkins, though, first of all, in his writings, Dawkins says that through biology, it looks like things are designed. There's the appearance of design. So this is in The Blind Watchmaker. Well, even Dawkins, who says that, well, even if we grant there's a designer, that designer would need a designer. and it gets more complex as you go up. Now, if you grant a finite designer, then I would agree that, yeah, then that finite designer would also need a designer. But if we can reach an infinite necessary designer, then we've terminated the move backwards from effect to cause, and you would no longer need a cause. You couldn't have a cause, or it wouldn't be the ultimate cause. I also don't think that the idea arguments gives us creation ex nihilo. Now, the cosmological ones can come close to this because we're told that the reigning Big Bang theory, if you reverse time, you'll see the universe implode back on itself, and it gets us basically back to nothing, back to what I think is called Planck time, and we're within under a second, I believe, with the universe. So we get really close to that. That's the one that makes me go, I'm not quite sure about that one. But in general, the idea arguments and certain arguments that are scientific don't really give us creation ex nihilo from nothing. I still think we would probably have to go beyond the Big Bang cosmology um, to really get creation ex nihilo. But you would have to have some kind of creative event by a being. But the Big Bang comes pretty close if it doesn't do it. And it doesn't also, I've already mentioned, it doesn't give us, these idea arguments don't give us the existence or the transcendence of the designer. So it's not they don't give us a current existence for the creator, and doesn't give us um, the transcendence either. It also doesn't give us full-blown classical theism. We're going to go into classical theism here in a few minutes. Classical theism is our full-blown traditional historical view of God. What this channel is all about, saying that God is simple, immutable, eternal, impassible, and all that. We don't really get that from the scientific arguments, but we do get it from the philosophical arguments. So let's keep on trucking. So evaluation here, they are, in my view, extremely persuasive. I think they're very, very powerful, especially since Western culture is so primed for scientific evidence. But they do have some shortcomings. They don't give us full-blown theism, as it were. But they're not without merit, of course, and they can move an atheist away from atheism and closer to theism, or not, or maybe even to theism if they want to hold that view. We saw this, I believe, with um, Antony Flew. So, what's the difference between natural science and philosophy? Well, again, natural science is a collection of various disciplines. We've already talked about chemistry, biology, and all that. That study the world through empirical investigation, whereas philosophy is an investigation into nature really just through reason, and it looks to the cause of things, the nature of things, and while it's informed by natural science, it's not limited to the physical world. Okay, so for example, philosophy studies being or existence. When I got married, my first wedding anniversary, I was in a week-long intensive class on metaphysics, which is the study of being or existence. I don't recommend that for two reasons. One, don't miss I didn't miss it, but for part of it, I was in class, your wedding anniversary. And two, I wouldn't take metaphysics in a week-long intensive. In fact, the school has never offered it again. That was back in 2005. And SES realized that was not a good idea. So I took it again later, or audited it again later. But metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with existence. What kind of existence? All existence. So whereas biology only studies living things, whereas physics only studies physical things, whereas math only studies things that are quantifiable, and chemistry things that are chemical, metaphysics studies all that stuff and anything that might even exist in an immaterial way. Now, I had a debate with Michael Shermer back in 2019, and it was an in-person debate at SES. We also had some back and forth in his magazine called Skeptic. And a well-known atheist named Richard Carrier responded to my article in Skeptic on his blog, and I in turn responded to him on my blog, which is brianhelfling.com. Very original, I know. And what Richard said is that if God did exist, science would, in principle, be able to study him, natural sciences. So I said in my response, and I would like to know what discipline the physical natural sciences could study an immaterial, non-natural, or supernatural being. I never have heard anything back. I didn't expect to. He probably didn't see my blog article, even though I tagged him on X and everything. What do you guys think? Can natural science, in principle, prove that a God exists? I was saying that no, it can't. Not in the sense that we're wanting to in the classical theist. Now let's look at some philosophy here. I gave this argument before. This is one of my favorite arguments for God's existence because I think it gives us a lot of mileage if it's valid and sound. Okay, if it's sound. This is the first of 5 ways from Thomas Aquinas. It says, and it's a little bit long, so bear with me. But I think we get a lot out of this. The first and more manifest way for what? God's existence is the argument from motion. Now, again, if you heard this last time, motion means change. Not that I'm going to grab my phone and throw it across the room. It's going to be an inertia, but that's not the kind of change he's talking. He's talking about all kind of change. A leaf going from green to red would be a change. Me standing up, cutting my hair, all that. Those are changes. Learning something, that's a change. He says it's certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion, or that is, some things change. Now, whatever is in motion, whatever changes, is put in motion or caused to change by another. For nothing can be put in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. Now, there's some Aristotelian language here. I know it sounds archaic and maybe weird. All it means is that it comes from the Latin potentia, for power. So if you want to change the location of a frisbee, for example, you got to be able to have the power to pick it up or throw it. It doesn't take much, but you got to have some, right? That's all that means. Something is in potentiality means you have the power to move it or to change it. I have the power to change where my phone is. I have the power to change where my microphone is. I can just move it around. Just all it means I have the power to do it. So nothing can be changed or moved unless it's in some kind of ability to be moved by something else. Okay, towards which it is in motion or toward which it's changed. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is an act. So all this means, and let me ask you a question: is the creation of the universe a change? I had this discussion with my PhD students last week before. Is the creation of the universe a change? I'm going to answer that yet. I want you guys to figure out and put that in the chat if you want to talk about that in the chat. Okay. Whereas a thing moves in as much as it is an act. So for a change to happen for Aristotle and Aquinas, it has to be in existence. You got to have something in existence that undergoes a process of becoming and then has a terminal state. Right. So the leaf is in existence. It undergoes a process of changing the color, and it goes from green to red or whatever, and you have a change there. So how does that apply to the universe? Is the creation of the universe a change, or is it something different? Going right along, he says nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality. All that means is going from being able to be standing to actually standing, for example, except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it's not possible, he says, that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. In other words, I can't be actually sitting and potentially sitting. I'm just actually sitting. I could be potentially standing or lying down. And if I did that, if I stood up, then I would be actually standing or actually lying down. I wouldn't be in potential anymore. I'll be actualizing that potential. Right. So when you say to somebody, you've got a lot of potential to learn or to be a good baseball player or whatever, all you're doing is you're saying you have the ability to become that. And then when you are becoming it, you're actualizing that change in that process. Okay. For what is actually hot cannot be simultaneously hot, but it's simultaneously potentially cold. So if I have a piece of wood on a fire, it's not hot and cold. It's just hot or it's cold, not both. It's therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved. In other words, the thing can't change itself. You got something that's existing and is undergoing a process of change, but it can't change itself. It's got to be changed by something else. Okay. that is, that it should move itself or change itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion, changed, must be put in motion by another. If that by which is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must seem to be put in motion by another, and that another again. In other words, if one thing causes something else to change, we'll say dominoes, for example. That's an easy illustration. If one domino falls over, knocks the next one down, then you got this chain effect going on. Okay. So if one thing's put in motion by another, and if that requires something else, then that must be put in motion by something else too. But he's going to say it can't go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently, no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only in as much as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it's put in motion by the hand. So if I grab, I can't reach my pen there, but if I push my phone, I push a coin on my desk here, the coin's moving because my phone's pushing it, but my phone's pushing it because I'm pushing it. I'm the ultimate mover here. Okay. Seeing that subsequent movers move only in as much as they are put in motion by the first mover, in this case, me, as the staff moves on. Okay, I've already said that. All right. Therefore, it's necessary to arrive at a first ultimate mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Okay. So this is the first of the famous 5 ways. I'm not going to read the other 5 ways. This is a lot. It's easy to remember where this is. It's in Summa Theologiae, part 1, question 2, article 3. So Summa Theologiae 1, 2, 3. That's how you find this question, this way. So what do the philosophical proofs demonstrate? Well, if that is valid and other arguments are valid like that, then God is a necessary being. Whereas the idea arguments show that you can have at least one designer, not a creator designer. There might be multiple designers. But with the philosophical proofs, whether that one or others like it, if they're valid or sound, sound means that the premises are true and the argument is logically valid. You don't make any mistakes. So I always tell my students, you got truth with the premises, you've got validity with the argument, and you've got both. Truth plus validity equals soundness. So if they're sound and God is a necessary being, what does that mean? It means he still exists. Because a necessary being, once it's necessary, if it's necessary ever, it's always necessary. Okay. It also proves he's infinite, because he's a pure act. So what Aquinas just showed is, in order for a change to happen, you've got to have 2 parts: an actually existing part and a part that's being changed, a part that allows the change, the potentiality. But if you arrive at a being that, as Aquinas says, is pure act and is not changed by anything else, then it doesn't have potentiality to be changed. This is passive potentiality. It doesn't have this passive potentiality to be changed. So then it's pure act or pure existence. If that's true, we get a lot of mileage from that. You get a lot of mileage from that. I think more so than the scientific proofs, and even more so from proofs that are somewhat philosophical too, but still rely on science, like the cosmological, like the Kalam argument. If they're inherently philosophical, we get, I think, more bang for the buck. Okay, so he is infinite existence. He doesn't have any kind of potentiality, so therefore he is infinite and pure act. He also is one. There can only be one of these beings. Why? Well, if there was an infinite being, and this is what sometimes how people will argue about different gods existing. If there is an infinite being, there can't be 2, because they would have to have some kind of distinction, right? So if one infinite being existed, the only way for another infinite being to exist is for it to have something that the original infinite being doesn't have. But if it doesn't have something in the sense of existence or being, then it's not infinite. So it either has to differ by being or by non-being. And Parmenides back in the ancient times told us that there can only be one being, because being is the very thing all things have in common, and nothing isn't a thing to differentiate. This is why years ago on the Stephen Colbert show, Lawrence Krauss said there's 3 kinds of nothing: and I forgot what they were. But the problem is he didn't read his Parmenides, because Parmenides showed that for two things to differ, they've got to differ by being or by non-being. If they can't differ by being, he said, and he's wrong, because uh, the being is what all things have in common, and they can't differ by nothing because nothing is nothing by which to differ. Well, they can differ by kinds of being, as Aristotle showed, different kinds of natures and this act potency distinction. But you can't have different kinds of nothing, because in order for two kinds of nothing to differ, they've got to differ by something or by nothing. If they differ by something, then it's not nothing. And if they differ by nothing, then there's no difference. Okay. So there you go. All right. So there can only be one such infinite being. All other beings are dependent on God for their existence. All other beings in the universe depend on God for their existence. So while God, there's no other being that's infinite, so there's one of him. He differs from the universe in the kind of being, because we are finite and material and contingent. He is infinite and necessary and all that. Okay. So also God created ex nihilo. We get this from philosophy that there can't be an infinite number of creators causing effects. So there's got to be a creation from nothing or a creation ex nihilo. Other attributes that follow from pure act would be he's simple, not made of parts. I discuss that on this channel a lot. I have some other articles on my blog and as well as on the channel here. So if you want to go check it out, go search for the simplicity art stuff. Because if he's not simple, he has parts he's put together like Legos are. To use a really um, basic analogy, that you got Legos, they represent different kind of metaphysical parts. You still got to have somebody to put them together. He is immutable. I mean, he doesn't change. He's impassible. He's not affected by us. This is really controversial. All these are now. And he's eternal. He's not in time in any kind of way. These are attributes that we get if God is pure act. So we get a lot of this argument if it really is sound. Do you guys think it is sound? You guys have any questions? So the critique of the philosophical proofs are these. One, they're hard. These proofs are difficult and they're foreign to non-philosophers. If you give somebody the Kalam argument, they're going to probably get it right away. And what's the Kalam argument again? Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. That's just straightforward. It's simple. Now, what you got to do though is show the universe does have a beginning. So what you have to show it has a cause. But the Kalam, now, it's not hard to do this, but the Kalam in and of itself doesn't prove theism. It doesn't prove that there's one God. Doesn't prove ex nihilo. It doesn't prove all these things. You could show really quickly that it's ex nihilo and God is infinite and non-spatial and non-temporal, because of the characteristics that are created in the universe, like matter, time, and space. But to show that, you would need further demonstration. Okay. So these arguments are hard. They're not easy to understand, but you get a lot out of them once you do understand them. Okay. They are more robust regarding the existence and nature of God than the scientific proofs. Okay. So the more robust, you get a lot more bang for your buck. All right. You guys still there? You have any questions? I think these arguments are really good. I use primarily the philosophical ones, but the scientific arguments are extremely powerful, and they do quote unquote practically work on most people in most instances. And I think that they really, because I think that there is one God, I think showing that there is an ultimate creator. We were discussing this in my high school class this past week. Is if you already believe there's a God exists, then looking at creation shows just how unbelievably creative he is. If you look at the diversity in biology and all the design, all the intelligence there, same thing with astronomy and cosmology and all that. So you can show from these ID arguments, scientific arguments in general, that God is extremely creative and that this can't be from chance. And if you start really looking at these arguments, they're extremely persuasive and powerful. And I just don't see how anybody can believe that all this is just chance, given the uh, all the design we see from the cell level all the way to the universe level. So that's all I had. I wanted to discuss this tonight. Do you have any questions? I'm not sure if you have any questions. I'm not going to belabor the point here. But thanks for watching. If you have questions and you're not here, you're watching this later, just leave a comment. I'll get back to you as best I can. Please like the video if you did like it, and maybe it'll be seen by more people. And I appreciate you being here. If you have any questions or comments, if you don't agree, which is fine, then leave that in the comment section. And I appreciate it. Thanks for supporting, and we'll see you next time.